Okay. So earlier I sent you what I'm going to kind of buzz through that chapter stuff over the next 2 days. We'll have 2 days this week. Basically it's a lot of review, but I thought I'd throw a couple of things out. So I added on the blackboard here, and you probably have them if you can still access the old anatomy, advanced anatomy website. But I put them on week 8. I just didn't put them as documents. What I did was I have the chapter on skin to look over, all the stuff that's there, that rather elaborate outline, skin appendages, etc., function, cancers, and then the tissue outline thereafter. With all and because that you probably should do that one first. It's background information, and that's to me from MCAT. Those are basic. Sometimes it boils down to the question: is it a tissue? What does a tissue have to have? It has to have cells, have to have ground substance, it has to have fibers. So it's fairly straightforward in that regard. So those are the kinds of things that you should take a look at in that context, in this. So I would review, anything that you can review in preparation. Even if you review it once or twice, it's got to be helpful. So we'll see if there's anything in here that refers back to. They have a whole unit on the skin. It's not very long. It was about. I scanned it this morning. I photocopied and ran it through I didn't really, the way I do it. We photocopy these and then we scan them, that type of a thing. But that's fine. And the way it works. So basically, the unit itself involves muscle, bone, and skin. It's the very last in that exam crackers text that both Dr. Hilwig and I use because it's got a lot of good information. This is kind of the last unit when you get. Again, we're going to probably see more about in respiratory. We're doing a phys. I'm sure toward the end I'll probably do that respiratory and digestive unit. As part of this class as well, just to reinforce it, etc. And they're just showing you what's here, the various levels, where they're using it muscle, and then skin, and then finally skeletal system that's there. So this, and we looked at most of this stuff already this year in physiology, so it certainly should function, I think, as a good review. Let me make sure I'm all on and record. Yeah, we're recording. Lovely.
We were recording like 10 minutes ago.
I know. I just because we had you on there, so we
that was a smart call.
Hey, me. So the 3 types of muscle: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. You probably have to know nuggets of each. I think the skeletal certainly predominates. The first thing that you look at with regard to those are involuntary and voluntary. Of course, skeletal mean by definition striated and voluntary. Involuntary or cardiac and smooth because we don't consciously control those. By definition, we consider cardiac to be striated because we can see the striations microscopically, and smooth is smooth because we can't see the striations. Is the way it's described. Contraction, and what do? Body movement, stabilization, moving of substances, blood particularly, body position, moving the body itself, generating heat, maintaining body temperature, etc. So we tend to look as we go through this. This is just, I'm going to highlight what they highlight. Striated, voluntary, everyday language. So what we typically call a muscle generically would, and I would think in a context of a test question, they would look at it that you'd have to see the term, what kind of muscle it is. Consciously controlled, innervated. Again, the distinction between autonomic and somatic. Sure.
About that, how were the test scores? Better than you expected or good?
Yes.
Okay. So it made you proud?
More some.
Was I included or no?
In what?
The test. No.
We did a different class. Yeah, you didn't. You did. I can recall one thing: you didn't fail. Not everybody has taken the test.
Oh, okay.
I still have people who I like who haven't taken the test.
I got you. I'm picking up your point.
I am. It was difficult, and I had a difficult weekend.
No worries. Sorry to interrupt.
Hey, so somatic, no, basically somatic means controlling the body in a sense of voluntarily controlling it, autonomic, involuntarily controlling it. So all the different things they talk about here, thermoregulation, fluid movement are certainly part of it because they assist in all of those. Cardiovascular, lymphatic, we have to rely on muscle activity, typically more active than passively, to assist with those kinds of things that are there. Yes, they connect one bone to another. Then you have, again, the distinction between attachments: direct, muscle directly into bone; indirect, being by way of a tendon or some type of other structure. Okay. When we talk about connecting bone to bone, that's where the ligament comes in. So the ligaments, and again, you have to look at the system. So when we look at digestive anatomically, we look at the liver and we talk about the round ligament, which is really a fragment of another kind of connective tissue called the umbilical ligament acting. It's not a true ligament in that sense. A ligament that's a real ligament, bone to bone, and it's part of the joint structure. That's really where we look at it more than anything else. So movement, and the only part I can't help you with, and I'd ask you to review it. And did Dr. Buxton talk about the different kind of like first, second, and third degree levers?
A little bit, not recent.
No, maybe I should ask him to pop that in because they talk about it in this exam crackers. It's probably worth it. And I would be a poor, what makes a wheelbarrow and a pair of scissors and that type of stuff. I know that. That's physics, and as you well know, I don't do physics. So, okay, yeah, and they may, muscle stretches across the joint where the origin and insertion. In general, if they're going to utilize that as a test question, origin is typically, to me, it's somewhat passe because we look more at attachments, and we'll talk about superior and inferior, medial and lateral. But in the old days, the origin was the larger and by implication the least movable bone, and the smaller or more movable bone was the insertion. Okay, and that you're moving relative to one another, so that's why I don't like the term as much. Agonist and antagonist. So in muscle whose contraction is primarily responsible for the movement is called agonist. The second muscle, because they're almost all in pairs, stretches in response and opposes the movement, so it's smooth and control. And we constantly, that's the distinction between flexors and extensors, abductors and adductors, internal and external rotators. All of those are effectively agonist. And what defines the agonist? The one typically is something that is the stronger, and it's typically the one that, if anything, is more likely to be a flexor. In general muscle parlance, flexors overwhelm extensors. They're more powerful than extensors. That accounts when there's damage to a muscle or a muscle-related system. We typically see, like in a stroke, flexion contractures. Or orthopedically, if we're going to see contractures, they're mostly in the direction of flexion, particularly if there's spasm. Because if they're opposing each other and they go into spasm, the flexors are going to overpower. That's a classically important point. In the upper extremity area and anteriorly in the abdomen and in the torso and in the upper extremities, the anterior area is the flexor area. In the lower extremities, the posterior area is the flexor area. That's useful. And palmar is more flexor, and plantar is more flexor oriented. So that's agonist and antagonist. Arm muscles, biceps, triceps, synergistic, work together. I mean, I do not know if you see them that they're in the same. So if you think of the biceps brachii and the brachialis, for the type of strength that we have in our upper arm area with flexion, they would act synergistically. They'd be in the same direction and be sort of augmenting each other. And I don't know if they're going to get it specific for like stabilizers. Let's say for something like a coracobrachialis, stabilizing the shoulder assembly so you can move it. I don't know if they're going to get quite as much about that as anything else that's there. Okay, so here they're just showing you where they are. Agonist, so you can have the long head and the long head of the biceps and the short head of the biceps. And here's the triceps that's there. And so this, if you're going to look at it this way, would be the serrator anterior. That is, or serratus anterior rather. That would be act more as a stabilizer in that regard. And here you can see it again, synergistic or a helper. They're showing here. This is they're showing as pectoralis minor, being synergistic as sort of, and again, synergistic meaning assisting with the process that's there. Oops, didn't do that. Thermal regulation, you're aware of. Contractions, heat, shivering, reflexes, a rapid contraction. Different than just generic contractions. The shivering are those rapid contractions designed to dissipate heat, which hopefully we're done with for a while. Cold. Blech. Blech. Okay. Blech. Hypothalamically controlled. Again, glycogen storage accounts for the energy that's utilized for that. This is the leverage portion of it. You can see, and that's when they're talking about load, and it has to do with where the fulcrum is. So, like your elbow, what kind of a lever is that? I can't really describe that to you, but they're describing it. It's a and that's why I wanted to remind you about, and I'll remind Dr. Buxton about it. Likely MCAT topic. Physical concept of levers to most but not all muscles act as third class or class 3 systems, meaning that the force applied by the contraction of the muscle by its attachment is between the fulcrum. Here's a force between the fulcrum and the load that's there. Okay, so it's here. So if you think of what your elbow is doing, here's the fulcrum, which is your elbow. Here's the load. Let's say a heavy object you're lifting with your hand, and the force the muscle's exerting here in between the two of them. That's a good way to look at it. Given amounts of work, in other words, a greater force. Makes sense. I love that. It's okay. I like
Like this, deadlift?
Yeah. Oh, I'd be dead if I tried to lift it.
Well,
I can't do that stuff.
In your prime, you probably could.
It had to be my legs were very strong, but my arms never were strong. Never really that good. I could bench pretty well.
Oh, yeah.
Comparatively, but curls and stuff, forget it. I had chin downs, not chin ups. Pull downs, like pull.
It took me 3 years to go do a pull up, and then I lost the ability.
I don't have that ability. A buddy of mine, he's still in the same shape. Okay, so we're both the same. I mean, he's already 72. Plays soccer every day. He's got a waist the same as it was when he was in high school. Sickening to see that. And he was one of those guys who would sit there, in gym when they'd have the ropes and the whole idea was to get you. He'd take them both in his hands, shimmy up that. Throw something. God. Physiology. This is the point I can teach you about. All that, and I can't we have so many illustrations available. Then you can look at the banding pattern, and I would look at it again. That's there. Let me see where that one is so I can take a quick look. See it. I brought the book. Because most of these pictures I can reproduce for you. That first one that they're showing you, that one is just the microscopic look at the striated pattern. So they're not necessarily focusing on that one with the A band, the I band, and that's something to review. If you don't have it readily accessible, that was chapter 9 from the Anatomy and Physiology textbook. I'll be glad I can post those on here. I have them, so maybe I'll throw that on as well. just so they're all handy in one spot. So that's the banding pattern that you can see there. The smallest functional unit, this is what you want to look at. Review what the sarcomere, effectively, this is the beauty of these systems, is they're mostly repeat units. You know, if we understand what goes on in the kidney and an individual glomerulus, you know what goes on in the rest of the kidney. In this case, if you go on, or in a nephron, you know what goes on. That's in there. Here's the same thing as the sarcomere is this individual unit. The cell is just an extraordinarily large amount of sarcomeres that are effectively arranged back to front, back to front. They used the boxcar analogy. And so what happens in one, when you magnify it, it happens in all of them. So the smallest functional of a contractile apparatus in the muscle is the sarcomere. Remember when we talk about a muscle fiber, that's effectively the cell. And it's not it's a unique cell because it's multinucleated. So it means it's a confluence or a get together of multiple cells. Thick and thin filaments, the thicker myosin, the thinner actin, you all remember that. The myosin molecules, which intertwine, they braid together, make up the thick filament with their heads. And remember, that's that interesting molecule where you have the heavier part and the light part. You have that molecule where the long strands interchange. I forget which one's light, which one's heavy. And then the head itself has that remarkable ability to change position. And on it, it has that active site. That's called an actin binding site because it's on the myosin head. Because again, anatomically, we name things not necessarily for what they're on, but sometimes where they're going to. And on actin, you have myosin binding sites. And when they get together in close proximity and the binding occurs, we're able to generate motion as that myosin head pivots, rotates, moves, ratchets, whatever word you want to use for it, and the actins are being pulled closer to the midline, basically compressing that sarcomere, shortening it. And when you accumulate the end-to-end shortening of those sarcomeres, depending on the arrangement of the sarcomeres, you get motion. Whether it's concentric motion, whether it's enlarging in the middle, however the arrangement is that's done there. The troponin and tropomyosin, which we're going to see shortly, they're the regulatory proteins, regulatory in that they control whether or not motion occurs. The tropomyosin is a strand-like protein that covers the active sites on the myosin. Remember, myosin is filamentous, but it's composed of little globules in that sort of double string of pearls appearance that we're so familiar with. It covers those binding sites, and effectively, if you want to think of it that way, is held in place by the troponin, which is a plug-like protein that secures it. I always use the analogy of thumbtacks or push pins, whatever you want to call them. When you move them, it zips out of that, it's around here, and when you move it, it does that. That's the only bad thing about having the iPods, the AirPods, because I don't have a wire. I used to do. Hey, it's important. Nobody. Slide past each other. The Z disc or Z line is the boundary. You have half of an actin on each side. So they call that the I band, I for light. The A band is where they overlap. A for dark, inotropic and anisotropic, if you want to fancy, because they may not be as polite. So it wouldn't hurt you to memorize those two words. Right? C is for cookie. It's good enough for me. It's a Sesame Street thing. And then, the H zone. So you can look at the anatomy of that, where the myosin is present or overlaps the A band, midline is the M line, myosin fibers in the center, blah, 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 blah. So end to end, they call it so the cell is the fiber. The interesting, within each fiber, we used a next diminutive, they're called fibrils. And each fibril, which are effectively cylindrical in shape, are packed with filaments. That's the actin-myosin. So review that anatomically. The fiber itself packed with fibrils. It's all that sort of anatomy portion of muscle. You have the muscle itself, epimysium, and just like nerve, it's divided into fascicles by perimysium, or in the nerve, perineurium. And when you break down what's in individual bundles or fascicles of nerve, you get the individual axons themselves. Okay, in that case, the blood supply is in the middle, versus in muscle, the blood supply is more external to it, coming in from the periphery. And what's inside each of the fascicles are the individual fibers, which are the individual extraordinarily long, not as long as a nerve, but let's say potentially a foot long muscle cell. And that is densely packed with rods that are identical, that we call fibrils. And those fibrils are densely packed with the individual proteins, which we call the filaments, principally actin and myosin, the troponin, the tropomyosin, the titin, which is the elastic component. So if you look back and look at all of those, you'll remember it's just maximally filled with protein, if you want to think of it that way. Protein, a fair amount of mitochondria, a fair amount of glycogen, a fair amount of myoglobin that's there. That's all part of it. So the fibril, each fibril is surrounded by what makes the fibril, what makes that whole unique thing is the boundaries, the endomysium. Underneath the endomysium, you have the actual plasma membrane, except we give it a new name. We call it a sarcolemma. Okay. So we give the interior cytoplasm a new name. We call it sarcoplasm. We give the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, since it has really a trace amount of rough endoplasmic reticulum, we call it the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And that's so the extensions of the membrane, the sarcolemma, make the T tubules that are distributed very similarly to the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which has the terminal cisternae on either side, where the T tubule kind of goes in tangentially or at right angles and surrounds effectively each of the fibrils. And that's really how the signal is promoted and generated throughout, releasing the calcium from the stored cisternae into the fibril, and then so too into the individual filament area where the filaments are stored. Create the motion. Ta-da. So the luminous sarcoplasm is filled with calcium ions for reasons that become clear. Lodged between the fibrils, mitochondria for the ATP, many nuclei, so it's by definition multinucleate, sarcolemma. Okay, and so when they talk about fasciculus, many muscle fibers are further bound into fascicles. That's what they're talking about. So I know that they're giving it the Latin term of fasciculus, but for us, it's fasciculus would be an individual one. These are together, we call them fascicles. So an individual fascicle, fasciculus, and then fascicles. Yeah, got to know your Latin singulars and plural, because they'll throw that at you. In the old days, we don't have to do it now. I remember going to school with a couple of guys. Everybody took either Spanish or French. A handful of people took German. And in my class of 260 people in high school, 4 took Latin, all trying to be doctors, of which one of them succeeded, who was a classmate.
I remember, I don't think my dad learned, but my grandma, I believe she only took Latin.
Right. I think that was the old, because it was all, Romance languages were basically Latin roots. It was a similarity between Spanish and Italian and Portuguese, French maybe to a lesser extent, because it just sounds different. French just sounds nice.
Yeah.
I'll probably say if I've got to go to the bathroom, probably sounds very romantic. I'm just saying.
I think Spanish sounds the best, followed by Italian.
Well, in food terms, I'll go for the Italian. Says, all I could think of is porchetta.
Oh, that sounds good.
Oh, yeah. Just pork tenderloin wrapped in like pork belly, seasoned and everything like that. Porchetta. Beef cheek ravioli. Okay, moving on. So, somatic nervous system, motor end plate, acetylcholine, remember? So, the action potential releases the acetylcholine. We all know about that. Without going, it's really the same thing with nerve, except the neuromuscular junction is just another synapse, except rather than being what we covered already, nerve to nerve, with the variant of neurotransmitters and what they did. This is a very specific synapse called the neuromuscular junction. So the nerve impulse goes down the nerve, calcium, voltage gated calcium channels basically induce the what are called end plate potentials, the release of neurotransmitter at the motor end plate. The big question is whether or not it's sufficient to reach threshold. If it's not, we call them end plate potentials. If they reach threshold, now we have an action potential. What effectively happens? The acetylcholine contacts ligand, acetylcholine ligand gated channels on the motor end plate, allow for sodium to come in, potassium to go out, effectively through the same channel, increasing the voltage in and around that area, hopefully reaching action potential if it reaches threshold. Then if it does, that'll be sufficient to carry that impulse to voltage gated first sodium and then potassium channels and propagate that in all directions. Remember, it's unlike the nervous system. This goes in all directions. From wherever it's stimulated, they'll get into the alignment of motor units here in this presentation relatively shortly. And it goes all the way around. And what does it do? Basically, that impulse is carried along the sarcolemma, along the T tubules. It contacts voltage gated channels in the T tubules that are aligned with voltage gated channels in the terminal cisternae, that when the voltage flip flops, it triggers the release of, in this case, remember this is the watchword for skeletal muscle, intracellular calcium levels rise. The calcium contacts the troponin basically is altered. It releases the tropomyosin from blocking the active sites on the actin, and they're in such close proximity with the myosin active sites, they immediately bond. They're preloaded with ATP. They fire, etc. That's and we went over that at length, that whole thing. So here's what they're talking about: action potential, T tubules, uniform contraction, spread through the muscle rapidly, transfer to the sarcoplasmic reticulum, voltage gated channels open, more permeable to calcium, which releases calcium in the myosin and actin. So you don't have to necessarily go into it in the same degree of detail I did, but to understand the process. This is what I was alluding to before. Here's the muscle, here's the fascicle, here's the fiber, and the rods, this being stuffed with rods. It's like not the box, but that plastic package of pasta. I made lasagna on Friday. Still eating it. Tastes better every other time you eat
it. You do the different meat, or you just ground beef, or you do the
This is a ground meat with a little bit of sausage in it. A little bit of sausage, and we take the easy way out, but it works. We use the Rayo's sauce.
I make my own sauce, actually.
Who doesn't? But the Rayo's is great.
Oh, yeah.
They're trying to get a very famous guy who you see him on TV all the time, but he's a very famous cop and then a detective named Bo Dietl. Grew up in the same area where John Gotti grew up, except he was a cop. He was of German origin, but acts very Italian because he grew up with all these Italian kids and queens. And so he became and he started his own investigative agency, and he acts in he always got bit parts in all these, Law and Order things like that.
Yeah.
And so since he got wealthy in the early 70s, later, he's had a Monday night table at Rayo's. And he said to Aaron Rodgers, "You come with the Jets every Monday night. You can come to my table."
I think he's going, but
Okay.
Zach Wilson, man, they're gonna kick the Mormon missile out of New York. But that's what they called him in college.
Oh, he's terrible.
What? For real? That's what his nickname was in college, I believe.
God bless. All right, so as we look into the individual fibril, so here's the muscle fiber, the cell. Here, again, you can see the transverse tubules on either side. You can't see it so obviously from the black and white image, but then you can see, remember we saw this illustration, and again, I'll just load those PowerPoints for fun later today, and you'll be able to see that relationship, how each myas is surrounded hexagonally by actins. It's roughly a 2 or 3 to 1 ratio. But the reality is, so it contracts not only does it shorten, but if anything, it compacts in the middle. And then depending on the shape of the muscle, it's why what we call a fusiform muscle that's sort of wider in the middle bulges. Or yours bulges, mine just kind of goes down. Sorry. And here's the A bands, the I bands, and all that type of stuff. They don't mention the titan that's, would be over here between the myosin heads and the Z disc. I mean, I just keep it in the back of my mind because it's about elasticity. So take a minute to think about the label parts, H, Z, M, etc., sliding filament theories, words of calcium plus U, etc., all that good stuff. And then this part. Now, I don't know. You probably should go back and look at that sequence of what comes first. Remember, the heads are preloaded. So when they're exposed, the contraction occurs. But what happens with regard to that contraction? I think the ATP hydrolyzes, then, when they come together, then it's released and they contract, and then when the ADP then is released, it contracts, and at that point to detach, more ATP has to come to the party. Once it joins, it causes the release, and then and then effectively, I think maybe then it hydrolyzes, and then it recocks the head. But you should look at that sequence. I don't know if that's going to be important, but here the ATP splits into ADP and inorganic phosphate, and the myosin head cocks into the position. Okay, so it's got so the inorganic phosphate is still there in the ADP when it's cocked. When it binds, okay, so they're showing you step by step. So let's take a look. One, now the cocked head has inorganic phosphate and ADP. The calcium binds to the troponin, okay, releases everything, and so that the active sites come together. Fine. Once they come together and bind, the myosin kicks out the inorganic phosphate, and the ATP bends into its low energy position, moving the actin with it. Okay. And so when the troponin blocks that, and that's whatever 4 looks like. Let me see how they describe it here. It looks like I cut it off. So in 3, we have this. So they're just what they were talking about over there. Oops. That's just a side image about troponin's motion. Here, troponin allowing them to contact. Here, when troponin slides back in, it doesn't allow it. When you move up here to 4, it says the ATP binds to the myosin and the actin. It binds to the myosin and the actin and myosin unbinds, and then it goes back when the ATP splits into ADP and inorganic phosphate starts to cycle over. So you should know those steps. So what it looks like before it fires is this, with both of them there. When it fires, the binding occurs, and then sort of simultaneously, the inorganic phosphate is somewhat expelled. The ATP is low energy, and then now it looks like this. And so once to unbind it, it has to be replaced by ATP. And then as the ATP hydrolyzes, we get the recocking that occurs. So those steps you should remember. High energy cock position in the resting state, phosphate ATP attached, tropomycins covering the actin, preventing the sites. So what happens once the nerve fires and it reaches threshold, calcium, the troponin changes its configuration. along the thin filament, pulling the tropomyosin back and exposing the active sites. They cross bridge. Myosin expels its phosphate and ATP and bends into the low energy position, pulling the actin along with it. That's the power stroke shortening, and it'll continue as long as there's adequate calcium and certainly adequate ATP stores for that to continue it physiologically. It can move. The new ATP attaches to release it. So we need ATP for the release with the precock the head. We need ATP for the action potential to be generated in the first place. We need ATP to pump the calcium back into the walls. There's a lot of energy dependence for muscular activity. They describe the motor units. So motor units, single muscle do not contract all at once. If they did, we lose the control. So you have anywhere between a couple to a couple of thousand fibers spread throughout the muscle, innervated by a single nerve. Okay? The nerve is called the motor, and all the fibers is the motor unit. The motor units depend on one another. The contracting muscle, the number and size of motor units, as well as the frequency. Okay, smaller motor units first, then larger as needed. Smooth generated contraction, particularly intricate movements, muscles requiring greater force and less finesse have larger motor units. So the ones with minimal fibers, like delicate digital movements, if you're sewing, if you're buttoning your shirt, that type of a thing, versus, you're going to do that lift. Yeah, large motor units that are there. All my root beer will wind up on the. I love that. I'm a root beer person.
Root beer float, can't go wrong.
Oh, yeah. Brown cow. Now, brown.
Pepsi floats aren't bad either.
They're not.
They're not root beer float.
But then what is? I actually like it with soft serve.
Ooh, those Dole Whips. Those Dole Whips you get like at Disney or whatever. Those things hit the spot.
You're toying with my emotions. That's what Emerald used to say. He had this breakthrough TV show about 20 plus years ago.
What was the name of it?
Emerald, a very famous chef, Emerald Lagasse.
Yeah.
And Emerald, it was called Emerald Live. They found a star out of nothing. And all of a sudden, it was just appointment TV because he had great guests, great cooking. He had a really good musical group because he was a drummer when he was a kid in high school. And so it's just, there aren't a lot of people who get to be the executive chef at Commander's Palace in the Garden District in New Orleans at about age 25 or 26.
Yeah.
Oh, help me. So you can see, so they're looking at the nerves, the terminals, etc., different motor units that are there. Oops, didn't mean to do that. So the limits with regard to fatigue, and we talked about that with the energetic. Okay, required for contraction, fatigue can result from either nervous or metabolic issues. Sustained use of the same motor unit temporarily takes it out of commission. Okay, so there's so many different, and again, we look at that and review that again in those PowerPoints. That was the start of the second PowerPoint where it talked about we have a certain amount of available ATP that we can use. Then you had the creatine phosphate. Then you went into anaerobic. And if you didn't convert by then, you just had so much fatigue related to the absence of ATP or ATP-like substances. And then because of the accumulation of lactic acid and particularly electrolytes and electrolytic imbalances, that the muscle couldn't continue doing anything. And so effectively you had to replenish the oxygen to sort of reset the system. So moderate exercise, enough oxygen to meet the increased demands through continuing aerobic. And again, I say it all the time, the transformation to aerobic is marrying circulation, heart rate, muscle activity, and breathing together. so that the same, the volume of the air, the output of the heart, the oxygenation, and the utilization of those muscles is all sort of grouped together consistently. And again, lactic acid is the accumulated waste product, has to be converted in the liver back to pyruvic acid, and we go back into the regular pathways, go back Krebs cycle. Did you talk about the fibers? Type 1, slow twitch or slow oxidative. Type 2, fast twitch or fast oxidative. And then lastly, fast glycolytic. Okay. Type 1 fibers are red because of large amounts of myoglobin. Type 1 fibers, large mitochondria, efficiently use oxygen. So when we begin to see these different kinds of fibers, fiber types differ in their contractile velocity, force, resistance to fatigue. Okay. So type 1s, great for endurance, slow velocity, low amount of force. Type 1 have the advantage they are slow to fatigue. So we tend to utilize those fibers, let's say more so for aerobic and sustained activity than anything else. Type 2, and again, sufficient amount of myoglobin for red, they're faster, resistant to fatigue, but not as much as type 1. Type 2, lower myoglobin, they're whiter in color, they contract rapidly and are capable of generating force, but they fatigue quickly. Most muscles, and then the type 2B fibers different. So you can see those different kinds of fibers that they describe. The type 1, the type 1s and the type 2As are a little bit different, but the type 2Bs, you're only using really for short bursts more than anything else. Most muscles have a mixture. The ratio depends on the contraction requirements of the muscle, genetically based as well, while some are just genetically. A lot of things you can change, and a lot of things you can improve and you can convert, but you can't, whatever your makeup is, you're a makeup. So natural aptitude, fast twitch fibers likely naturally better at sprinting than someone with slow twitch, would be marathons. Type A ones, postural muscles. Type 2As, acceleration muscles, upper arms, upper legs. Type 2B, upper arms. And again, they're not mitotic. Again, all they do is undergo hypertrophy, not hyperplasia. You can make what you got bigger, but not more. And they just summarize that, and then there's a passage. And if you can't read the questions, I start to look through it to see if we get these. We'd like to get those questions looked at. And then you can read through this other unit before I go over it for tomorrow. And we can try to look at the questions Wednesday. Because it's all review stuff, the other muscles that are there. And if we get to the bone and skin, so be it. And if we don't, we don't. But let's try to get the muscles done. Right? These are all done for today.